We are joined by Dr. Joel Lexchin. Dr. Lexchin received his MD from the University of Toronto in 1977. He is a professor emeritus in the School of Health Policy and Management at York University in Toronto, Canada, where he taught public health policy until 2016. In addition, he worked in the emergency department at the University Health Network in Toronto for over 34 years before retiring in 2022. He has published 2 books since 2016, Private Profits versus Public Policy, The Pharmaceutical Industry in the Canadian State, and Doctors in Denial, Why Big Pharma and the Canadian Medical Profession Are Too Close for Comfort. He is a member of the Foundation Board of Health Action International and on the board of Canadian Doctors for Medicare. He is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and is among the top 2% of the world's most highly cited researchers. He is acclaimed for being a pioneer of greater pharmaceutical industry accountability, a legendary physician, and is a role model to other physicians seeking to become involved in advocacy work. Despite these well-deserved accolades, he would most likely to be remembered as, quote, a good clinician, someone who cared about his patients, someone who cared about colleagues, someone who cared about the institution. So thank you so much, Dr. Lexchin, for joining us today. We're so looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, thanks very much. The last part of that introduction was not written by me. I'm not sure where it came from, but I'll take it. So what I'm going to do in this talk is try and convince you that the large drug companies do not just make drugs. What they also do is they control the production of knowledge. And controlling the production of knowledge means that they influence how you look at diseases, and they influence what you know about what treatments to use, what the benefits and risks of those treatments are. That doesn't mean that you're puppets in the hands of drug companies, but it does mean that a lot of what you are going to learn as you go through medical school or as you go through advance in your other careers is generated out of the drug companies, and it's generated to make sure that they continue to sell their products at prices in the United States which are not really conscionable. Okay, so here are my conflicts. By the way, if you, in standard talks, these are up for about 2.8 seconds. Somebody actually timed how long speakers leave up conflict of interest slides. During this talk, if you have questions, feel free to ask, or you can wait until the end. It's up to you. Okay. So this is the reality of new drugs. This is Canadian data, but really it's not any different in Canada, the United States, Australia, the UK, any of the advanced countries. So the blue at the bottom that you see are the drugs that really matter on an annual basis. And that's about 15% of new drugs that are introduced actually make a major difference in the patients that we treat. So that's about 1 in 7 or so. The orange are the ones that are of moderate gain. So they may be useful, they may be helpful if first-line therapy doesn't work. And that's about another 25%, 30%. And then the gray, that's all the rest of them. Over half of the new drugs that are introduced really only benefit the drug companies. They don't benefit patients. And even when you look at drugs that are supposed to be major advances, at least as claimed by regulatory agencies like the FDA or the drug companies, it's still the case that most of the drugs that are introduced don't have any significant new therapeutic value over existing products. And these are what the FDA labels as breakthrough drugs. Now, that may be the reality, but that's not how the drug companies would like you to think about new drugs. They want you to think that every new drug is a home run. And they do this, they get this message out through something that's called ghost management. What ghost management means is that before a drug is even on the market, drug companies are laying the grounds for that drug. So you pick up a medical journal and you read about what are the safety issues with current therapy for pick a disease, or how can we advance treatment in pick a disease. And these are often articles that are written by people working for drug companies, paid by drug companies. And what they're doing is they're saying, current therapy isn't good enough, but we've got something coming down the pipeline that you should know about. Then they plan the clinical trials that they're going to run because they're looking at, okay, what's the market for this new drug? Not what the need is necessarily, but what's the market for it? And how can we design a clinical trial that's going to play to that market so we can use the results of the trial when we go and sell the drug? The drug companies own the data from those clinical trials. They analyze the data. When the drug gets approved, they pay what are called key opinion leaders to go out and speak to doctors about the drug. These key opinion leaders are often leading researchers who are delivering messages that the drug companies have formulated. A lot of the medical journal articles that you're going to read are written by what are called ghostwriters. These are drug companies hire medical education companies who write the article with the message that the drug company wants. And then the medical education company finds people who are willing to sign the article. So these people may not have had any access to the data. They may not have made any substantial contribution to the article, but their names are on it because those names say that this is good research. Patient groups are funded by drug companies because patient groups are seen as more objective, more unbiased, and patient groups then go out and deliver the message that the drug companies want. Medical journals are often paid by drug companies in one way or another. So you people aren't really old enough to remember, but there was an article about a drug called Vioxx that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 2000. That article, the drug was made by Merck. Merck bought 1 million copies of that article to distribute. So that's money into the New England Journal of Medicine coffers. So all of these are aspects of ghost management, and we're going to talk about most of them during this talk. Before we do that, though, we need to talk about Willie Sutton. Has anybody ever heard of Willie Sutton? No. You would have if you lived in the 1930s. Willie Sutton was an American bank robber. And when he was finally caught, the story goes that a reporter went up to him and said, "Willie, why do you rob banks?" And Willie said, "That's where the money is." So when we're talking about about drugs, where is the money? And when it comes to drug trials, it's pretty obvious that the money is with the drug companies. So the NIH funds some medical research. There are charities, hospitals, foundations that fund some of it. But by and large, when it comes to clinical trials, and the clinical trials are what forms the basis for what we know about drugs. It's the drug companies that have the money. And the drug companies get their money because they charge you people enormous sums of money for prescription drugs. These are brand name drugs. Your generic prices are actually lower than those in Canada. But your brand name prescription drugs cost roughly 3 times what the Canadian price is. And that's even when you look at discounted prices. So the drug companies are making their money by charging you lots of it. The United States, there are 350 million people in the United States, so that's about 5% of the world's population. You people spend almost half of all the money that's spent on prescription drugs. So that's, I think, about 600 or 700 billion dollars a year. And that's money that goes to the drug companies. So where do the drug companies use their profits? And they would like you to think that they use them doing research on new products so that you can be healthier, have fewer symptoms, live longer. But in fact, if you analyze how the big drug companies spend their money, they actually spend more of it on what are called stock buybacks. So stocks are out there in the public. Drug companies buy back their stocks to drive up the stock price because executives in the drug companies are largely paid based on what the stock price is. So they buy up their stocks. Fewer stocks means each share is worth more money. And they also use money on dividends. That's money that they pay out to people who own stocks. And if you add up the figures at the bottom there, you can see that between 2005 and 2000 and whatever it is, 1918, the drug companies have spent more money on stock buybacks and cash dividends than they have on research and development. So that money that you're paying for prescription drugs is going to make a lot of people, well, actually not a lot, a small number of people, very rich. And it's not going into producing the new drugs that we would all like to see that are going to be major advances in therapy. And the money that drug companies actually do spend on doing research and development are not necessarily spent where the need is the greatest. They're spent where the market is the largest. And so if you look here, oops. Okay, my cursor isn't working. Look in the top right corner. 4.4% of the new drugs that were introduced between 2000 and 2011 were for neglected tropical diseases. These are things like malaria, schistosomiasis, African sleeping sickness, things that kill millions of people every year. But those people live in countries where the average per capita amount of money to spend on prescription drugs is $20, $30, $40 a year. That means you fill one prescription and that's it for the rest of the year. So these people have little to no buying power. So the drug companies are not interested in whatever ails them, despite how many people may be affected. What they're interested in are products that are going to sell in the rich West. And it doesn't often matter how necessary those drugs are. So there's a drug on the market currently that will lengthen eyelashes because people want longer eyelashes. There are drugs out there for toenail fungus. Now, toenail fungus doesn't look very nice, but nobody has ever died of toenail fungus. In fact, the emergency department, I never saw one person with toenail fungus who came there because of that. So drug companies are looking to invest in research and development. And remember, that's not their primary goal. Their primary goal is to drive up their share prices, but they're looking to invest their research dollars in products that are going to make them money. And this just is another example of how the priorities of the industry are distorted. You can see there, so distinct LIC, what does that mean? It means LIC is low-income countries. That's countries where per capita income is about $1,500 US or less per year. I think your per capita income per year is about $70,000. So 2.89% of clinical trials, are in low-income countries. A lot more trials are in high-income countries. Again, that's because that's where the money is. And if you look at what the difference between what do people want when it comes to diseases and where does the money go, you can see the difference. So OA, that's osteoarthritis of the knee. So somebody asked different groups, what would you like to see in terms of treatment for osteoarthritis? Rheumatologists, they thought that NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, that's things like ibuprofen, Advil, naproxen, were over-researched. Patient groups wanted more research on education and self-help. General practitioners thought that drugs were over-researched, oral drugs, and they would like to hear about conservative treatments. So braces, exercise. Physiotherapists thought that there were too many drug trials and they wanted physiotherapy and exercise. But where did the money go? Well, the money went into researching oral drugs because that's what drug companies do. They make medications in addition to producing the knowledge about them. So I talked about preparing the market. So this is an example of that. So Adrian Fuberman, who runs an organization called Farmed Out at Georgetown University in DC, was approached to write a piece about the interactions between herbs and warfarin. Warfarin at that point was the most commonly used oral anticoagulant. So people would be on that to prevent strokes if they had atrial fibrillation, a variety of things that required oral anticoagulation. And Adrian Fuberman was an expert in herbal therapy, in addition to teaching at the medical school at Georgetown. So they wanted her to write this article. She was interested in why they wanted it and talked to them and eventually decided not to write it after she got the response from the drug company, which was, and you can see that on the right-hand side there. And what the drug company was doing, or what this medical education company was doing, was laying the groundwork because shortly after this article was going to appear, there were going to be a new set of oral anticoagulants that came out called NOACs, novel oral anticoagulants, that didn't require the kind of monitoring that warfarin did. So they were going to be marketed as more convenient for patients, not necessarily better or safer. So when Adrian Fuggerman declined to write the article, this medical education company just went to somebody else who did write the article for them. I talked a little bit about clinical trials. So has people heard about the Cochrane collaboration? Anybody heard about it? Okay. Cochrane was started by somebody named Archie Cochrane, who lived in the UK. And he decided, or he felt that what the medical knowledge that was out there was not being properly disseminated. So he organized this group of people that has grown substantially. And what they do is they pick topics and they scour the medical literature on these topics. Usually they're looking for randomized controlled trials, but not all the time. And they synthesize the knowledge into meta-analyses or systematic reviews. And then they publish that. So Cochrane reviews are done on a whole bunch of different topics. And this one, which I was one of the participants in, was a Cochrane review on what kind of results do you get, what kind of results and conclusions do you get from clinical trials, depending on who is paying for the clinical trial. So we looked at this, we found, well, you can see there were thousands of different studies that ended up being synthesized. And we found that if the trial was paid for by a pharmaceutical company, it was 5 times more, almost 6 times more likely to give you positive conclusions. That's the bottom, the middle paragraph, and 1.25 times more likely to give you positive results than if the trial was paid for by any other kind of funder. So other kinds of funders would be foundations, government organizations, NIH, charities, hospitals, whatever. Having a drug company fund a clinical trial was a way to make sure that the clinical trial had positive results and positive conclusions. And what applies to clinical trials funded by drug companies also applies when the lead investigator on a clinical trial has some kind of a relationship with drug companies. And that's what this slide shows. That if the lead investigator has a financial relationship with the company making a drug that's being tested, it's almost 3 times more likely that that trial is going to show a positive result. So when drug companies fund clinical trials and when they fund the investigators who are running those clinical trials, what they're doing is making sure that those trials are going to produce results that are favorable to their interests and that are going to help them sell more drugs. Drug companies also hide data that they don't like. So Vioxx, anybody heard of Vioxx? Nobody? Okay, Vioxx was a new kind of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, something that was supposed to protect your stomach, because traditional NSAIDs like ibuprofen or naproxen can be very hard on the stomach and can lead to ulcers or gastrointestinal bleeding. And this drug, Vioxx, was supposed to protect the stomach. And it may have. Unfortunately, it also caused more heart problems, so people ended up dying of myocardial infarctions, or at least having heart attacks. So Vioxx was being tested by Merck for Alzheimer's disease in a placebo trial. The idea was that non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, besides protecting the stomach, may also help protect the brain, and that's why they were looking at Alzheimer's. So what they found in the study actually was that more people were dying on Vioxx than placebo. But when Merck submitted the information to the FDA that showed this, what Merck said was that there were small numeric differences consistent with chance fluctuations. In other words, the message to the FDA was, don't worry about these numbers. They're really not important. But if you look at the actual numbers, they really were important. You can see there what happened to death rates over time in people who are on the placebo versus people who are on rofecoxib, which is the generic name for Vioxx. And as people were on it longer, the difference in mortality rate kept getting bigger and bigger. Okay. There's a concept called seeding trials. Seeding trials occur once a drug is on the market. It's been approved, the company is now selling it, and they want to increase their sales. So one of the ways of doing that is by running what looks like a clinical trial, but it really isn't. What it is, it's a way to get doctors to start using a drug. So you approach a bunch of doctors and you say, we're running a trial to see whether or not children like the flavor of our drug better than the flavor of another drug. The clinical trial is meaningless. It has no scientific value. But what it's designed to do, it's designed to get the doctors to start prescribing the drug, because the company knows that once a doctor starts to prescribe something, as long as it's not killing their patients, that at least a substantial number of those doctors are going to continue to use that drug. So they run these seeding trials to increase their sales, not to generate any useful scientific information. And this is just an example of a seeding trial. Again, this involves Vioxx versus naproxen. And you can see the quote from the article about this trial. The trial was designed by Merck's marketing division to fulfill a marketing objective. The marketing division handled the scientific and marketing data, including collection, analysis, and dissemination, and Merck hid the marketing nature of the trial from participants, physician investigators, and IRB members. And marketing trials actually may end up in really well-known, respectable medical journals. So this is a study where a group of leading experts, so Virginia Barber used to be the editor of something called PLOS Medicine, and there were also editors of the British Medical Journal involved in running this study. What they did was they went through leading medical journals, so Annals of Internal Medicine, New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, JAMA, And they tried, based on their reading of the articles, to figure out, is this a seeding trial or not? And what they found was that there were actually a substantial number of seeding trials. So they looked at a total of 194 clinical trials, and they felt that 41 of them, so 20%, were seeding trials. And these were seeding trials published, as I said, in very leading medical journals. These are probably the top 6 general medical journals in the world. So you don't like the results of a trial. One way of dealing with that is to what's called reframe the results. And this is an example of that. We're dealing here with another one of these new anti-inflammatory drugs, celecoxib, Celebrex. Name familiar? No? Don't worry. Another drug that was supposed to reduce inflammation and protect the stomach. So this is a figure that was published in the article about celecoxib in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And this looked at the incidence of GI ulcers, symptomatic GI ulcers, in people who are on celecoxib versus more traditional non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. And if you look at this figure, it looks like celecoxib actually was better in protecting the stomach. But this figure is a distortion of the real results of the study, because this figure looked at results after about 16 to 20 weeks. What happened? But the trial didn't go for 16 to 20 weeks. The trial actually went for 12 months. So in other words, 52 weeks and longer. And when you got up to how long the trial actually did run for, there was no difference between traditional NSAIDs and celecoxib in terms of stomach protection. So what the people who wrote this trial and had done was just publish partial results that made the drug look good, not results that showed how the drug actually worked. Other times, you don't have to distort the results. You just bury the results, so nobody is supposed to see them. So these were studies about an SSRI, a selected serotonin reuptake inhibitor called Paxil. Serexat is the name of the drug in the UK. Paxil is the name of the drug in North America. Paxil was marketed as an antidepressant. The company wanted to expand the market to include children and adolescents who had depression. And so they ran these trials. Study 329 actually did get published, although published in a very distorted manner. The other study, though, 377, wasn't successful. It didn't show any benefits. So you can see there at the bottom, they weren't going to submit the results to regulatory authorities because the drug didn't work. Nobody should know about that it didn't work, including the FDA. And this is, again, what they said. It would be commercially unacceptable to include a statement that efficacy had not been demonstrated, as this would undermine the profile of paroxetine. Paroxetine is the generic name of the drug. So you just don't find the results because they're buried in somebody's bottom drawer. or today they'd be buried in somebody's computer somewhere. Some people actually did know about the results of these trials, but they had signed what NDAs with the drug company, non-disclosure agreements. So if they had revealed the results of the trials, they would have been sued by the drug company. So you don't submit the results, and for the people who do know about the results, you make them swear to silence forever on penalty of being sued. And if you're ever sued by a drug company, they've got a lot more money and very smart lawyers. And even if they don't win, they'll tie you up in court for years. Trials do get published, but they don't necessarily say the same thing as what the FDA would hear. So this again looks at trials of antidepressants. There were 74 trials that people analyzed. They got access to the FDA review documents. So what did the FDA have to say about the trial? And then what was in articles that were published in the medical journals. So 38 of the trials the FDA thought were positive. In other words, they showed that the antidepressant had some benefit. Out of those 38, 37 got published. One didn't get published. There were 12 trials where it was difficult to figure out if the drug had a benefit or not. So 6 of those were published, but they were conflicted with the FDA decision about what the trial showed, and another 6 just were never published. And finally, 24 trials were negative. In other words, the FDA said, these trials show that the drug either doesn't work or it's not safe to use. 3 of those 24 were published and agreed with the FDA decision. 5 were published and disagreed with the FDA decision. And 16 trials never saw the light of day. So if a trial is negative, it either is buried or it's spun in medical journals. There have also been substantial changes over time in what trials look like. Now, again, this is Canadian data, but it mirrors what goes on in the United States. So more and more there are fewer pivotal trials when new drugs get marketed or submitted to a regulatory authority like the FDA. Pivotal trials are the ones that really show whether or not the drug works or not. There may be other trials submitted, but the pivotal trials are the ones that count. So the drug companies are running fewer pivotal trials on new drugs. Phase 3 are the big trials, the ones that enroll thousands of people in them, the ones that give you the best results. The percentage of phase 3 trials that are being run is slowly going down. Randomization is still okay. Blinding, though, in other words, neither the patient nor the person administering the therapy knows what the patient is getting. The percentage of blinded trials are going down. There are very few what are called superiority trials. This is when a drug is tested against another drug. And the idea is a superiority trial means that the new drug is better than the existing one. There are 2% of all the clinical trials are superiority ones. What's a non-inferiority trial? A non-inferiority trial says that the new drug isn't any worse than the existing products. And single-arm trials are ones where you're only testing the new drug and you have no idea about how well it compares to the other drugs for the same problem. So when a new drug comes on the market, because of the way that the drug companies run the trials, people like me and you in the future have really no idea how it compares to existing products. And finally, drug companies test the majority of their drugs on what are called surrogate outcomes. So surrogate outcomes are things like, for cancer, does the drug shrink the tumor? Or does the drug increase the length of time before the tumor gets bigger? But unfortunately, those kinds of measures say nothing about whether or not you're going to have a better quality of life, or whether or not you're going to live longer. And at least half of the new cancer drugs that come on the market based on surrogate outcomes, shrinks the tumor, lengthens the time until the tumor progresses, at least half of those drugs never are shown to make your quality of life better, or to let you live longer. But they're quicker to do, you can get results faster, and you can get the drug marketed quicker. And that's why drug companies use those. So when you're looking at clinical trials, you have to look at where those clinical trials are being published. So it may look like I'm picking on Merck, and maybe I am, but that's only because Merck spent gazillions of dollars marketing Vioxx when it was on the market. It was finally removed, by the way, in 2005, when its safety problems could no longer be ignored. So Elsevier is the world's largest publisher of medical journals, based in the Netherlands. Owns and publishes The Lancet, for instance. So Merck cooked up a deal with Elsevier to help it sell Vioxx. What was that deal? They produced a medical journal paid for entirely by Merck, called the Australasian Journal of Bone and Joint Medicine. Made to look like a real journal, but the sole purpose of this journal was to publish articles that were favorable to Vioxx. It had no other value, and the articles, of course, were controlled by Merck. So we talked a bit about ghost management, and part of ghost management, as I think I said, was ghost writing. So ghost writing is where the company controls the messages in the article, they control who wrote the article, they control where the article is going to be published, at least they try to. And you can see there where the opportunities are for the sponsor, that's the company paying for all this, to intervene. So a medical writer from a medical education company outlines the article, sends it to the sponsor. Sponsor says, yes, no, maybe, make these changes, goes back to the medical writer. Medical writer drafts the article, goes to the sponsor. Sponsor says, okay, Then the article goes to the guest author. The guest author is somebody who may or may not have any access to the data, may or may not have been involved in any way in running the clinical trial that's the basis for the article. The guest author then may make some changes, may not, goes back to the sponsor. Sponsor says yes, no, make some further changes, and then it goes through, goes to the journal, goes back to the journal, looks at it, does a review, goes back to the medical writer, not to the people who actually know anything about it, but to the people who are paid to write the article. And finally, it ends up being published. And this is an example of what happens with ghost writing. So Zoloft, another SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. There were worldwide publications, was hired to write, Current Medical Directions was hired to write up articles about Zoloft by the company that makes it, which is Pfizer. So they write the articles, and you can see there that what the status of the article was. Poster presented at a meeting, poster presented at another meeting. Who is the author? TBD, to be determined. So they had the articles all written up, and then they were going to decide whose name was going to appear on the article. Key opinion leaders. So key opinion leaders are typically well-known physicians, researchers, and these people are not necessarily bribed by the drug companies. In fact, the drug companies usually choose people who are already saying the same thing that the drug companies want the rest of the world to hear. In other words, this is a good drug, this is a safe drug, I use this drug before I try anything else. So what the drug companies are doing with these people is amplifying their voice. Instead of one of these people giving 1 or 2 talks a year, the drug companies will hire them to give 10 talks a year, 15 talks a year. They pay for them to fly to where the talk is being given. They fly them, by the way, business class, not sardine class. They pay for them to stay in 5-star hotels. They give them good meals. And these people then give out a message. They believe in the message that they're giving. And it's, as I said, it's the same message that the drug companies want other doctors to hear. And the drug companies monitor the effects of the talks that they give by looking at, okay, who attended the talk? And the drug companies have ways of looking at what these people who attended the talks are prescribing. So they look at, did the number of prescriptions for the drug increase after the talk? And if the KOLs didn't do a good enough job of convincing their audience to prescribe the drug companies just don't bother inviting them back to give more talks. They look for other key opinion leaders who will be more successful. And as I said, KOLs believe in what they're doing. So they're not, in their minds, they're not lying. But when the drug companies pay for them to give these talks, what they do is they're drowning out other voices. So the people who are skeptical of the drugs don't get hired by the drug companies. There's no money to fly them around to cities to talk to audiences. So the other side of the opinion about new drugs doesn't get heard as widely. So, clinical practice guidelines. So, a new drug is on the market. There have been studies done about it. Doctors are wondering, when should I use this? What are the right people to use this on? How long should I prescribe it for? What should I be watching for in terms of interactions? All that kind of stuff. And a busy doctor, there may be 50, 100 articles about a new drug or the treatment of a particular disease. And doctors, busy doctors, just don't have the time to read that volume of material. So that we rely on what are called clinical practice guidelines. This is when somebody else, or typically a team of people, have gone through the medical literature, looked for the best pieces about the drug or the disease, synthesized all that material, and then written it up in a form that is user-friendly, so that I, as an emergency doctor, if I want to know how to treat somebody with atrial fibrillation who comes into the emergency, I can go through one of these clinical practice guidelines and see, okay, who should get this drug, who should get that drug, what should I watch for, that kind of thing. And these clinical practice guidelines can be quite helpful. And the drug companies also know that. So who is on the committees that write the clinical practice guidelines? And this looks at a whole bunch of different medical specialties where clinical practice guidelines have been produced. And it looks at what percentage of the authors of those guidelines had financial relationships with the drug companies. And you can see there that for gastroenterology, neurology, oncology, orthopedic surgery is probably a relationship with medical device companies. The majority of people had a relationship with a financial relationship with the drug companies. And if you remember back a number of slides, if you have a financial relationship, what you're going to produce is likely to be favorable to the drug companies. So there's a good chance that these clinical practice guidelines are also going to be favorable to the drug companies. Cost effectiveness analyses. So this is the drug worth the money? So the drug costs $2,000 a pill. Is the value of that you get $2,000 worth of benefits from that pill? And that's by and large what cost effectiveness means. So who pays for the cost effective analyses? Well, you can have the drug companies pay for them, or you can have other organizations pay for them. And what this slide shows is that if the drug companies pay for the cost-effective analyses, they're likely to be positive. In other words, yeah, it's worth spending $2,000 a pill. Then if other organizations have funded these analyses, it's not that there's a greater chance that if other organizations fund them, that they're going to say, no, the drug isn't worth $2,000 a pill. So again, a bias in knowledge about how useful the medication is is it worth the price that people are paying? We talked about Cochrane reviews. Cochrane, if you're looking at a meta-analysis, and a meta-analysis simply means a statistical, combining a bunch of studies through statistics. So if you're looking at a Cochrane meta-analysis, which is done, the head of a team that's writing a Cochrane meta-analysis cannot have any relationship with the company that makes the product or with any other drug company. And the majority of people on the team that's doing the Cochrane meta-analysis cannot have a relationship, financial relationships with drug companies. So if you're looking at a Cochrane meta-analysis versus a meta-analysis paid for by drug companies, again, what you find is the same thing. The Cochrane meta-analyses are going to be more skeptical about the drug, going to find that the drug isn't nearly as beneficial as what the company is saying. The drug is less safe than what the company is saying, compared to meta-analyses that are paid for by the company that's making the product. And this is just one particular example. So on your left, you can see what the article said about a particular drug for weight loss. The article was written by was funded by what was called an unrestricted educational grant from 11 different pharmaceutical companies. The conclusion was that the drugs were produced clinically meaningful weight loss and were generally well tolerated. Same drugs being studied in the article produced by The Lancet, but not paid for by drug companies. And the conclusion was, increases the risk of psychiatric adverse events, recommend increased alertness of physicians to these potentially severe psychiatric adverse reactions. So completely different conclusions about the value of this particular product. One conclusion influenced by who paid for it, one not. Continuing medical education. Well, across North America, once you get a license, if you want to keep your medical license, you have to attend you have to put in a certain number of hours of continuing medical education per year. Here in Ontario, where I worked, it was 50 hours a year. And I'm not sure what it is in the US, but it's probably roughly the equivalent. So you can get your CME in various ways. And one of the most popular ways, at least before the internet, used to be by attending conferences. And conferences can be paid for through your fees. In other words, you'll be charged $500, $1,000 to attend. Sometimes conferences are sponsored by medical societies. So the one I went to, Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians, funded their annual conference, or they can be paid for by industry. So you don't have to pay anything. You may have to pay for your hotel room, but you don't have to pay for the registration fee. Now, let's even assuming that the content of the conference, of the talks that you're going to listen to at both sets of CME funded by the different kinds of organizations, is that they're equivalent. In other words, the lectures you're going to hear at industry-funded CME are just as unbiased as the ones you're going to hear at non-industry funded CME. The topics that are chosen are going to be much more oriented to the products that the drug companies are making, and what the kind of therapy that's going to be talked about is going to be primarily drug therapy, not all the other kinds of therapies that you might be interested in, not how to diagnose a problem, not how to prevent it. So if you confine your CME largely to conferences that are funded by industry, because you want to save money, you're going to get limited, your knowledge about the drug or the disease is going to be more limited. And if it's about the disease, the therapy is going to be more drug oriented. So finally, what happens when people speak out about the drug companies or about their products? This particular article talked about 26 different cases of where doctors, medical journals, drug bulletins were critical about products that were made by various drug companies. And what did the drug companies do in return? Well, they threatened the people, or they threatened the organizations. They intimidated them. If you worked at a medical school, taught at a medical school, somebody from the drug company might phone up your dean and say, "Why are you letting this guy get away with it? You should do something about it." Or they would take them to court. So, and that's exactly what happened. So Wyeth, I think Wyeth is now owned by Pfizer. Wyeth was marketing a product for weight loss called fenfluramine or Pondamin. Pondamin turned out to cause primary pulmonary hypertension. In other words, increased pressure in the lungs. Very poor available treatments for this. Lots of people die from it. And Pondamin was being criticized by doctors in Montreal up here in Canada. And so they just got in touch with people at the medical school and said, stop them from saying that. It's not good for our business, and we want you to do something about it. Here's another case, back to Vioxx, and somebody who was criticized about it. Somebody from Merck calls up Stanford University and says Dr. Singh would flame out there and there would be consequences for Stanford. Suing. So Spanish Drug Bulletin criticized Vioxx. Merck's response demanded that the bulletin retract the article and publish text written by Merck. The bulletin refused. Merck sued the bulletin and the editor and lost in court. If you want to learn more about any of these things, here are a few articles that you can use, that you can look up. And that's it for me.